Nebraska, we get a quarter-inch rain while we're in moderate drought. Hey, that's something to stand up and cheer. Something else to stand up and cheer is Parker Albers, the pride of Hardington, Nebraska. Parker is training to be a high school social studies teacher, and I know he's going to be a good one. We've talked about the topic of his paper over the last year. I think it's timely. Ladies and gentlemen, Parker Albers.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Parker Albers, and my topic is on nationalism, sensationalism, and the perception of American tragedies. If you're still sitting there wondering what does that even mean, or maybe you're here because Dr. B gave you extra credit points, we're going to get into that. Even when I explain to my friends what my topic is, I can see the confused looks start to show up as I go through it. The first thing I want to start off with is I'm talking about American tragedies, which is something that can be a pretty sensitive topic for people, especially if maybe you knew somebody that was involved in that tragedy, or you've heard a different story of it and you believe that story, and maybe I'm going to go against that, and you have every right to disagree with me. I'd be glad to listen to your disagreements after my presentation. I'll always take extra questions. So let's start it off with what even is nationalism? So nationalism is a devotion to one's country. In America, we're more likely to refer to it as patriotism, but this is something that goes for every country. It's credited to appear in the rise of nation states in Europe, as it was a way to unite people under one border and create like a collective identity, which is something that's needed for a nation state to occur. And then sensationalism, which is like how the media kind of hypes up events or uses emotions to draw a narrative. It has been seen in every sort of American tragedy, as tragedies draw in viewers, and newspapers want viewers, so they go towards the tragedies to try to pull in people. I'm focusing on wars and conflicts, where sensationalism has been drawn to create a narrative to go to war, or maybe has changed the way we view the conflict, but for like political narratives, sensationalism also has a strong impact, as politicians are huge drivers of sensationalism. In an era with Donald Trump as a political candidate, and whether you like him or not, he loves to use sensationalism to draw clicks towards him or to build up his campaign. So the more people that know your name or know your policies, you're probably going to stand at least a slightly better chance. There's also a psychological aspect to sensationalism, as these fear-driven or emotionally driven stories, they stick with you. And as we go through an era of social media where people can get into like a confirmation bias chamber, as your social media algorithms push kind of what you believe in. So then these effects become long-term, because the more you learn about the same sort of sensationalized content, the more you become to believe it. And if it's at a nationwide scale, it can even become history. My first example of how nationalism has impacted American tragedy is in the Texas bedtime story of the Alamo. And I was hoping to get maybe one laugh out of those pictures, but that's all right. It's all right. It's 8 a.m. I understand. The first thing that I want to talk about is how the Alamo was framed in a way that put it as Texans versus Mexicans. So it's a two-party conflict. So you have your honest American Texas defenders who drove their F-150s to the Alamo to fight against the ruthless Mexicans. And obviously I am using a little sensationalism myself in that narrative, but I don't know if I stretched the story as far as they did at some points. They also like to frame these people as like American heroes. There are tons of stories of how this battle started with Colonel Travis, drawing his sword in the sand, telling people they can either stay and fight for Texas or they can run for their lives. And all but one Texan crossed that line and decided to die for Texas. And there was one coward that ran away, and based on my little meme here, he must have been from California, because a real Texan wouldn't run away. Then you have Davy Crockett running around in his raccoon hat for camouflage in the desert, for all the raccoons they have out there. Or Bowie, on his deathbed, but still gonna fight for Texas. Unfortunately, that's not really what happened. Even this narrative of Texas versus Mexico is a bit of a stretch. If you look at the numbers, only 13 of the 200 Alamo defenders were native-born Texans. A majority of them, even if they were a white person, were European settlers. These were Scottish, Irish, British, German people who really weren't involved with the Texas independence movement, who came to fight for them. There was also even Mexican civilians who decided to fight along with Texas because they thought it was more beneficial for their interests. And then even if we go to the Mexican side, 1,066 people died at the Alamo. 833 of them were Native Americans. So it wasn't a Texas or a Mexican side, it was a kind of a mix on both of them. The motivations of the defenders are also largely ignored. We can sit here and attempt to say that they were righteous, all they wanted was Texas, and maybe there was a few of them where that was a key interest, but the whole independence movement was largely based in Texas' desire to continue with slavery, which in 2025 we understand that's not exactly a righteous cause. The defenders wanted personal glory. They saw fighting the Spanish as a way for them to increase their prestige within America. They could even possibly get a high-ranking position in the military from their actions. So this was not a selfless stand at a church. Then this is an event that has just become covered with myths and stories. Davy Crockett is someone who has almost become like part of our national legend for this, even though he was, I wouldn't argue he's as important to the story as it's made out to be, or even as important to American history as it's made out to be, but through his actions in the Alamo, he has become almost a mythical American being. And even if we go to Colonel Travis drawing his sword in the sand, further investigations have concluded that that didn't even happen. So the whole narrative has kind of been shifted into this more of a myth than actual history. As far as sensationalism, the prime example is in the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, as when the ship exploded, media outlets, specifically newspapers, decided to run with the story as if it was Spanish sabotage that caused the explosion. There are a few reasons that this happened. For example, like I stated in the beginning, sensationalism sells. These newspapers ran a story that Spain was responsible for the explosion, and they sold more copies. So they continued to run with these stories because it's a business. People got to make money. I understand it. But there was also the aspect that a war with Spain would also be good for newspapers, as it would continue to give them sensationalized content to discuss. And once again, they wanted to make money, so this narrative fit their desires better. When framed as a Spanish assault or as Spanish aggression, it makes our retaliation in the Spanish-American War almost like a righteous action. We had to do this. Add on the Cuban independence movement, and now we're doing this for Cuba. We're standing up for American values. And there's even more issues when we look at the fact that Further investigations have concluded that the explosion of the ship was likely contributed to an internal explosion. The most common explanation is an ammunition fire or a coal fire, but there's still not a decisive conclusion on what happened, but it's more than likely not Spanish. It was not Spanish called or Spanish influence. And that's a shame when a lot of people died fighting the Spanish thinking that they had caused this tragedy. And then if we look at what came out of the Spanish-American War, it's an expansion of American colonialism. So while we can say that we fought for Cuban independence, what happened is that now we control Cuba, or the Philippines and Guam. I have two tragedies that are the main kind of argument in my paper. The first one is 9/11. I wasn't born before 2001, so I don't have a first-hand experience of what the news was like after 9/11, but the television news outlets were running this continuous stream of the towers falling, people running away, the firefighters clearing out the rubble, clouds of dust, people jumping out of the Twin Towers. It was all just created this fear-based narrative around the event, and I'm not going to blame the news media because this was a scary time in American history. There was an attack on American soil and Americans died in a way that we had not seen in a long time. But it also framed us as victims, as this country that, how could this happen to us? We've never done anything. And politicians ran with this story to try to push into Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq. Bush would go and talk to, like, America, and he would use a lot of nationalist sayings. He would talk about how this attack was on who we are as a people, on our values, democracy, freedom, all to justify what he wanted to do with the event, which was to go fight in the Middle East, or there was an expansion in like the federal government, so you'd see more control coming out of this, such as like the USA Patriot Act was created following 9/11, and the Department of Homeland Security was created, so the federal government got an expansion of their powers by using nationalist words. But 9/11 is more complicated than just what happened on September 11th. There are causes of 9/11 that stem back decades. The United States has had a huge influence in the Middle East for a long time, and those that were living in the Middle East were not always on board with that. For example, Osama bin Laden really disliked American military presence in Saudi Arabia, and there was other instances where the U.S. would use military pressure just so we could get lower oil prices, and there were other things at play. But that's one of the key ways that they saw it. We're going in there using military power to keep our oil cheap. And 9/11, there was reason to believe that something like this could happen. It did not come out of left field. For at least a decade, the United States have been trying to use intelligence agencies to understand how a terrorist attack could happen. They understood that people may not be all that pleased with some of the things that the United States was doing, and something like this could happen. They obviously thought it wouldn't happen, or at least like to hope it wouldn't happen, but the idea was out there, and more structured things should have been in place to prevent this from occurring in the first place. And then even after 9/11, something that isn't quite talked about is the amount of destruction that came out of 9/11 from us as we would go into Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and over 80 other countries to perform counter-terrorist operations that would cost the lives of at least double the amount of Americans that died in 9/11, let alone maybe 100 times more Middle Eastern deaths. And then for Pearl Harbor, the narrative around Pearl Harbor was a little different just because I think there was more shock. Pearl Harbor and 9/11 are very similar, but since Pearl Harbor had happened, there was more protocol for what to do in 9/11. The first articles that came out after Pearl Harbor were very censored, as the United States was still trying to figure out how to explain what had happened that day. So instead of focusing on the destruction or what happened, they instead like to focus on the American heroes, like the Navy soldiers that were on the base and how quickly they were able to respond and prevent further devastation. But they also like to talk about the U.S. as this peaceful, neutral nation, that the Japanese did this sneak attack. How could they betray us? We have nothing to do with this war. But that's not exactly true. Pearl Harbor goes back a long time. If you look at how Japan got even into a position to do Pearl Harbor, you can trace it back to the U.S. if you look hard enough. When Commodore Perry forced Japan to open up their borders, it caused Japan to need to industrialize. They had two choices: either industrialize or go under the influence of some other foreign nation. And the pride of the Japanese, I don't think would have let that happen. So this leads into the Meiji Restoration that takes place. But the problem is, Japan can't really industrialize by themselves. While it is a strong nation that would be willing to put in the work, they don't have the natural resources needed to industrialize a nation. They don't have the amount of coal, oil, or even other metals that are required for an industrialized civilization, which requires them to expand into an empire. Something like the British had done to get more natural resources into their country, because there's not, when you're an island nation, you just don't have enough. Not every country is as big as the United States. And when they expanded, the United States did not agree with this policy, so they placed oil embargoes on the Japanese, which would significantly hinder their ability to create an empire, let alone industrialize. So Japan made a choice to strike first, because they can't compete with the American economic military power that we are. So Pearl Harbor was a way to try to put pressure on the U.S. Senate to try to keep us out of the war so they could continue to expand their empire without the oil embargoes. And then after Pearl Harbor, the United States enters the Pacific front of the war, the European section of the war, and thousands of Americans would die in this international conflict. Especially in the Pacific front of the war, this was brutal warfare, where I believe the number is estimated like 200,000 American troops died in the Pacific front of the war, where it's about 2,000 would die in Pearl Harbor. So we 10 times our own casualties to get revenge for something. And that's not even looking at Japanese casualties, as if you lowball it, about 5 million Japanese civilians would die in World War II through starvation, the war itself, and then the ultimate culmination, which is the atomic bombs, where we commit our own tragedy against the Japanese. And while there are arguments for why we should have used the bomb and why we shouldn't use the bomb, the reality is that we caused our own tragedy. We caused the Japanese tragedy in retaliation for something that they did to us. Now, why does any of this matter? Outside of the 3, 4, 5 bonus points that Dr. B has probably given out for you showing up to this, what's the point of anything that I'm talking about? To me, the main thing is, why do we study history? Is history just some book of facts that we read to memorize? We learn people's names, we learn how many people died, we learn what they did. To me, that's not it at all. History is about learning from our past. And if we don't understand the way that these narratives around tragedies have been influenced, we're never going to be able to properly learn from them. If we take 9/11 as some surprise attack that we could have not avoided, the only thing that comes out of it is an expansion of federal powers, because that would be the only way to stop some surprise attack, as the government needs more control. But if we take it from the perspective of what we did in the Middle East, how can we prevent like that level of hatred towards America from culminating again, then there's a place to grow from it. And these factors that I'm talking about, they're always going to be present. While I talk about historical tragedies and how nationalism and sensationalism have influenced the past, they're not gone. Americans are still united by our values, and the media just keeps getting worse. These things aren't going to change, but if we learn to identify them, we can grow with them. And then finally, citizens are empowered by questioning. If you just take the media's narratives at face value, that's what you're going to get out of it. But the more you're willing to question the information that's presented to you, the more you're able to participate in the events that are happening. You're just not being told about them. You're taking an active role